In our gospel today from Luke, we get a version of Jesus, if you will, that perhaps we're not so used to hearing, or at least the modern world and its popular conception of who Jesus is and what he does is not used to hearing. It seems to be that for the modern world, or for the culture at large, Jesus is a sort of live and let live kind of guy. Be nice, but do what you want to do. Tolerate everything and everything will be okay. And of course, as we know, that really is very far from the Christ of the Gospels. He calls us to something much greater, much deeper than simply to say live and let live and be nice. What he calls us to in today's Gospel is to set the world on fire, a fire which he wishes was already burning. Now, if you've been outside much in the last few days, you might think the world already is on fire, but he's not talking about humidity. He's talking about what it is that he himself has come to bring, and then what he wants us to bring to this world, or rather, what he wants to bring to it through us. The truth of who God is and what he has called us to remind the world of the relationship that it's called to. The relationship which was severed in the garden at the original sin, at the fall, and yet God so desires to bring it back. And as Christ makes clear in this gospel, this will not be something which is always tolerated. This will not be something which the world will usually accept willingly. That fire which he calls us to bring, the fire of the gospel, the fire of the message of Jesus Christ, very often is intolerable to the world. Because it challenges the powers that be, it challenges the way things are by reminding us all the way things could be, should be, in our relationship with the one that created us. And so when he says, yes, there will be division, even some that you know and love will not be able to accept what it is that you bring, and yet nonetheless, I, the Savior, am starting this institution, I am starting this church to set the world on fire. You, its members, are called to be the embers that burn, so that the world might know me through you. That is our vocation as the baptized, and I think it's good for us constantly to be reminded of that. The other wonderful thing we have in our church and our tradition, as we hear in this second reading today from the letter to the Hebrews, is that we already have a cloud of witnesses. We already have those that we can look to as inspiration, as examples, as ones that we strive to be like, ones that we realize fulfilled this mission in this world so well, and that we ourselves might be able in some measure to do so also. I want to talk about a few of those witnesses because I think it's good for us to be reminded of these stories. It's good for us to realize that even at times when things seem very dark in our world, very far from God in our world, these men and women are raised up to be reminders to us of what God has called us all to and how he might change the world through them. Starting in the earlier days of our church, let's go all the way back to the late 5th, early 6th centuries. When the church has come out of the age of being illegal and hiding, has conquered the empire, most people, as a part of the Roman Empire, are now Catholic, including the emperor himself, and yet so many of the old practices remain. So many of the things carried over from the pagan days of the Roman Empire. Chief among them was the most popular sport of the day, the gladiatorial competitions, most famously which took place in the amphitheaters, especially the Colosseum in Rome. It's hard for us to imagine just how popular this tradition was. For centuries, this was like the combination of the NFL and the NBA all into one. And yet it was an inhuman and terrible thing for a Christian empire, a newly Christian empire, to allow two men to fight, oftentimes against their will, until one of them was dead, was something that perhaps I hope is hard for us to imagine, or maybe it's not so hard to imagine. But this sport was popular everywhere. The church would cry out that it should not be allowed, that it should cease, and yet it was too ingrained until God rose up a witness from the cloud of witnesses to put a stop to this. Perhaps the saint you've never heard of, a saint called Telemachus, or sometimes pronounced Telemachus. He was a simple monk from a monastery that happened to be in Rome one day to go to the market, to the forum, to purchase things for the monastery, and he noticed it was mostly empty. But he could hear the roar from Flavian's amphitheater, what we call the Colosseum. He could hear it, and he knew that the games were going on inside, and he'd never seen them before. So he went in to see a crowd screaming in joy, cheering as he saw the carnage and the blood that was on the arena, and two men fighting until one of them was going to end the life of the other. Telemachus, realizing what a horror this was, jumped down, as the story goes, as we are told from the accounts, ran down the stairs and ran into the arena and stood between the two gladiators, begging them to stop. No one's quite sure exactly how, likely by mistake or in the heat of the moment, one of the gladiators swung their sword, but Telemachus in that moment fell dead on the floor of the arena. And as it happened, the emperor himself was at the games that day. And as the imperial court historian recounts, he sank back into his chair, his throne, and for the first time realized how awful this all was. And an edict went out from Rome that day to the entire empire, forever banning the games, that they would never be legal again. To this day, when you go to Rome, you can still go to the Colosseum and see the architectural wonder. Perhaps we don't think about that great monument of death stands silent because of the witness of someone who came to bring that flame of Christ's love and to remind us every human life has value. It doesn't matter who it is. Human life is sacred, and human life belongs to God. Fast forward then to the Middle Ages, the 13th century, when the church is the dominant social force, at least in Western civilization, what we call Christendom. At a time when the most important thing for anyone who was born was to know what they were born into. Who was your family? Were you in the aristocracy and the nobility, or were you a peasant? Were you rich and powerful, or were you someone who worked the fields? The social classes were very clear. And the worldly concerns, wealth and power, those became, even for members of the church, even for members of the hierarchy of the church, became slowly more and more important until perhaps they became even more important than the spiritual mission of the church. And again, in that time, God raises up someone. I know someone we've all heard of, Francis of Assisi, born into a noble family, born into an extremely wealthy family. Anything this world could have had to offer, he could have had. Every door could have been open for him to do whatever he wanted to do. And in the early days of his youth, he took advantage of that until he realized this is not what is most important in this life. We are forgetting what truly matters. And God called him in that moment to set the world ablaze and to remind them of the true priorities of this life. Francis famously, and to the horror of his father, gave away everything he had, including his clothes, taking on a simple habit and starting a movement that by all measures should have failed immediately, what we call the mendicant movement, of men and women who take up the call to own nothing themselves, to trust entirely on others for their mission. Each day, going day to day, meal to meal, simply to spread the word of Christ and to remind people of the dignity of the poor, and that the things of this world are not what truly matters. That movement took off. The Pope himself, Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes of all time, realizing how important this is, and the reforms that brought about. To this day, the Franciscan movement, the Dominican movement that followed, are one of the most powerful in our church to remind us of what truly matters in the kingdom of heaven. And finally, in our modern world, in the 20th century, again, in one of the darkest moments in our race's history, in the camp of Auschwitz, a man we just celebrated his feast day a few days ago, Maximilian Kolbe, a priest who was put there for opposing the Reich, who himself stepped forward to take the place of another man who was to be put in a cabin and starved with a group because of an escape. His desire to save the man's life and to minister to those who would be dying was strong enough that he realized it was worth giving his own life for. We know that story because that man survived the war and was there when he was canonized as saint in St. Peter's in Rome. Maximilian Kolbe, that small flame which set ablaze a reminder to us that evil never wins, that God's goodness has already defeated it, and that even in the darkest of times there is hope. All of these stories, and these are just three, from the early church, the Middle Ages, the modern church, three of thousands of the cloud of witnesses that are known to us. Perhaps you have your own favorite story. Perhaps there is someone known to you that is not as famous, known to you and your family, the one that handed you the faith, the one whose example you seek to follow. God gives us this precisely because we as human beings need it. We need these reminders. And here's the wonderful thing: we've all been called to be a part of this cloud of witnesses. We have all been called to be an example and a reminder for someone else, for our posterity. Each of us in a different way, but no one is without that call. So on this Sunday, as we are reminded to set the world ablaze and how much Christ wishes it were already ablaze, let us take it up and let us bring the fire of his love wherever we find ourselves in this life, so that in years to come, others can continue to take up the torch and take up the task and have looked back to us to say, they did it, we can do it, we will continue to do it because it is Christ who does it through us.